Welcome to this recording. The purpose of this screencast is to spend a few minutes reviewing changes to the statewide special education procedures. At least once a year, the state provides revisions to the state procedures, and what you're looking at right now is where these are located. Communication that this video is being sent out to many people will also include easy links to find this, but you can see I'm looking at Iowa IDEA, so www.iowaidea.org, and we can see State Special Education Procedures, and we can see that the new version is located here. So as I do this recording, I'd just like to remind everybody, I would just encourage you to remove old versions of the procedures to avoid confusions and download a new copy from the site. So here's the full procedures, very large document, over 500 pages, but I'd encourage you to download it to your computer. Once it's there, it's very easily accessible with good links. There's also release notes. This is a much shorter document that summarizes changes. So you'll see highlights of language and things that have been changed in the procedures. So reviewing the release notes is a good way of taking a look at what has changed since last year. And in fact, as we continue the video, we'll primarily be walking through those release notes to give you kind of an orientation to things that you should be aware of. There's also some standalone documents that are also housed here on the site, but I mainly want you to draw your attention to the new procedures that I'm encouraging you to download, remove old ones, and the release notes as well. So what you're looking at here, I have a downloaded copy of the new procedures. Just want to do a quick orientation of what it looks like. It's a very large PDF document. It does have very handy links within it. So you can see we can click on a table of contents, and for various kinds of sections, we can go to detail table of context or right to a section. So if I click here, there's more detail. All of the subsections are linked. So for example, if I click here, transition from pre-K to K, this is an example, it will take me right to that particular section. So it really is handy to find things. And then you notice here that there's ways to return to the table of contents or go to the appendix as well. So I can go back here. I want to point out too that the very important and very helpful appendix to the larger manual is Appendix A, the documentation guide. Most of you will recall that this is a section that kind of gives you a page-by-page guide to the forms on the IEP. So if we took a quick peek there, let's go to the detail. What we're seeing here in Appendix A would be just literally all of the various pages and sections of the IEP with guidance on how to complete them and examples in many cases. So for example, if I went to page D, goals, it will take me there and I'll see literally kind of an image of what that IEP page looks like in our current state web IEP system. And you'll also notice that blue hot links are present. So if I click on, for example, measurable annual goal, that's going to take me to a guidance section with information that's going to be helpful in completing that. And then you'll also notice that there's various links throughout here. We can go back to the table of contents, we can go back to that D page, and other places as well. For example, this will take me to some additional goal examples. So just very handy ways to move around the document, and when necessary, go back to the table of contents and look for something else. You'll also notice with this being a PDF, there are some very functional search kind of items. So you can see I am on a PC up here at the top where you see this magnifying glass. If I click there, for example, I can do a search and find. So let's try something. So for example, if I want to look for the word transition, it will search for that keyword. And you can see it's going to take me to the first occurrence. We can keep clicking next, 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 and it's just going to continue through the document finding occurrences of that word. Now, as you can imagine, this is a pretty common word in the document. We could look for other things, for example, FBA, functional behavior assessment, if I wanted to find occurrences of that, same kind of idea. I can go and find each occurrence of that term in the document. So just some options for helping us to find information on certain topics in a pretty easy manner. So what you're seeing now is actually a copy of the release notes, the document that summarizes changes and modifications. And you can see here it tells us right at the top that points of emphasis are highlighted. So in yellow highlight, you can see some important information that has changed to draw your attention to that. We'll spend a little bit of time walking through some of these changes. We certainly won't go through everything, but the intention is to kind of orient you to some of the key changes, and then you'll know that you'll be able to go back to this document and to the procedures themselves as a reference as needed. So just on our first page here, you can see there's a couple summary statements of the things that we're going to find that have changed this year. First point here, just as a note, the Iowa AA Directors of Special Education, and they work with the Iowa Department of Education and the Procedures Coordinating Council that meets throughout the year, have initiated a review cycle of the procedures. And so for this particular set of releases, there were certain areas of the manual that were intentionally reviewed on a cycle, and you can see some of those topics there. Individual education program, kind of those core sections that talk about types of IEPs, types of IEP meetings, preparation for them, how to make changes, and also that topic of unique placements. There were other items even beyond the section that was part of the cycle that were addressed because of a need to do so. And you can see some of those topics there. We will walk through and highlight some of those as follows here. First thing I just want to draw your attention to is there was some intention in this release to begin a process of adding some rules references in the procedures. In other words, when the procedures are described, there will be times where you will see actual rules from the administrative rules of special education referenced. But in order to keep the size of the manual down, the DE was working with Microscribe to design a site that will kind of house some of these references online. So just as an example, let's go to this sample shown here on IEP drafts. And so you can see when I clicked on that link, it took me to this website. As you can see, has just a lot of detailed rule, and it took me to the particular language from that rule. In this case, it was just as our example, the rule of construction on final versus draft IEPs. So in other words, these items, the text is not included in the procedures document, but there'll be hyperlinks built in that will take us to that as needed. So then readers can reference those rules specifically by using the hyperlinks as needed. So let's take a look at a few topics. You can see this topic here, IEP teams, meeting attendance, and roles. During the review process, there were several sections that were combined and roles were reviewed. And let's take a look at some things that I want to draw your attention to in that section of the release notes. So thinking through IEP meeting participants and attendance, you can see some of the yellow here, just some additional emphasis on the individuals who fill specified rules, and the importance of each of those participants providing either presence or input to the IEP, and just emphasis on participation and involvement from all those individuals. Again here, I just want to point out in the manual, you'll see references to code, to rule. If we were to click on those, and when you do in the manual, it will take you directly to that website that I just showed you that will house the rule itself. Now I've scrolled down a little bit on this section on participation, and you can see a lot of yellow here, some changes. The question here with some clarification: what if an eligible individual doesn't have a general education teacher? So there's some more clarification here. The requirement is actually that A general education teacher is a required participant of the IEP team if the student is or may be participating in the regular education environment. So there are some fairly rare cases where a student is not participating at all in the regular education environment. So the examples given here are the rare occasions where the student is in a completely self-contained placement. So technically a general education teacher is not required there. Another example, a preschool age individual who is not currently enrolled in any educational program such as Head Start or the statewide voluntary preschool program. But then we have some students who may be participating in regular education, and you can see the examples there. If in doubt, if the student may be participating in any way in general education, it's just reinforced that a gen ed teacher is a required participant at the IEP meeting, but there are some rare cases where the student will not be. That's typically more of your self-contained kinds of placements that we don't see very often. And let's talk about this role in the IEP team. It's listed here as district or AA representative. We've often used the language of LEA designee, but in this case, we're talking about the person who's qualified to provide or supervise special education, is knowledgeable regarding general education curriculum, is knowledgeable regarding resources, and is authorized to commit resources, whether it be district or AEA. So typically, this would often, a principal would often be the LEA designee, and then in some cases we'd be thinking in terms of allocation of AA resources as well. So for example, sometimes we may have a speech-only IEP. But the topic here, a public agency needs to determine who that staff member will be, who's going to be that agency representative, and that again is the person who has the authority to commit resources. Because it is important, we know that an IEP is a legal document, and so the public agency would be bound by the IEP that's developed. So we want someone there who's able to commit those resources. So notice this next paragraph. I'll just read part of it. At the point of the IEP meeting when resources are committed, a district representative or an AA representative, in the case of AA resources, who is authorized to commit resources must be present. So for example, if a district administrator is present only to greet the participants, facilitate introductions, and convene the meeting, someone else must be designated. So what this really comes down to is that the point in the meeting where there's a designation of resources, the designee should be there. It should not just be a drop-in kind of a situation. Notice this third paragraph mentions in the case of an eligible individual who receives or is anticipated to receive AA support services, that AA support service provider would typically serve as the representative. So for example, it could be a speech-language pathologist or an OT who would be present, essentially designating their resources. We also know that a required role for an IEP is an individual who can interpret the instructional implications of the evaluation results. While this is not really new information, the language is kind of re-emphasized. You can see it's in yellow here. So just a reminder that for initial IEP meetings and reevaluation IEP meetings, that must include a representative of the AA because that person is deemed as the person who interprets evaluation results regarding eligibility because of the AA role in that. A little section here on electronic meeting notices. By rule, we are told that parents may elect, and that's the word used, may elect to receive notices electronically, but that is by parents' choice, not the districts or AAs. So it is possible, for example, documents that might include parental rights, IEP meeting notifications could be delivered electronically, but that is if parents elect to do so. But some additional clarification, any such electronic communication must contain all the information required in a meeting notice. So when we think of a meeting notice, it's pointed out in our notes here that an email or a text that just says the time of the IEP meeting is not adequate. electronic communication would need to contain all the information that would normally be in a staffing notification, because to not include all that would be deemed to depriving the parent of an opportunity to appropriately respond or ask questions and so forth. So that's just a reminder that something like a text or a brief email saying that the IEP meeting is on this date cannot replace the staffing notification itself, but yet that notice could be potentially sent in an electronic format if the parent elected for that to happen. So when we think about our required IEP participants, we also know that there is an excusal form and that there is a process where we can excuse someone from an IEP meeting. So who must be excused? When will we use that? Clarification is that IEP team members who would fill required roles, for example, a gen ed teacher, special education teacher, district AA rep, and individual who can interpret evaluation results. If one of the required roles, if a person will not be in attendance, they must be excused using the excusal form. However, non-required participants who are part of an IEP team that might appropriately be part of it, the district transportation director, a transition organization person, if they are invited but cannot attend the IEP meeting, they could provide their input to the IEP team, but we wouldn't be required to do the excusal notice. So the excusal notice is only an official process for the required IEP team members. This next little section, information that may be important to review in advance and or have available at the IEP meeting. Notice that this is not particularly regulatory, but is pointing out that having data regarding student progress and this kind of information can be very helpful for IEP team members to be able to review in advance. Examples of things are given here. So the procedures are just pointing out that teams should consider providing these things to participants in advance, but it's not listed as regulatory. And some of this information may be included in an IEP draft. This next section, data standards for adding services and supports in a new area. That's referring to adding goals and services for a new service area. So we could think as an example, perhaps a student has been receiving reading services, but there may be a new need in the area of math or in written language. It would be adding a new support area to an already eligible individual. Now, while previous versions of the procedures did give guidance on this, there's been some clarified language on how to do this, and you can see the so if we're wanting to add a new area, first of all, we're given some guiding questions that the team can think about in terms of, might this student need a new service area? And then the procedures go on to point out that there's different ways that we could add a new service to an IEP. So the first one here is adding it a new goal area through an annual review or an amendment. Okay, and it gives some examples of how we might do that. So perhaps if we're, and the example shown here actually is kind of what I cited earlier, maybe we're adding math services for students. So first off, in the on the goal page, if we were to be adding a new math goal in the current academic achievement and functional performance, we would add data that describes the need. So you can see here, Karina, we have some data pointing out math issues and math needs there. So that would be one way, that would be how we would document that in there. And then an example is given. A prior written notice would describe the addition of this math service and an explanation as to why we're doing this and why the needs are there. So in other words, there is a way to add a service using just an amendment or perhaps an annual review. Sometimes, though, we would add services through a reevaluation. So when appropriate, and for some students, a reevaluation may be done where we would gather new information, new assessment data that might lead us to a new service area. And of course, in those cases, we would have the reevaluation page with the reevaluation questions. And we would address in some of the questions such as 5 and 6 regarding eligibility. We would talk about these new needs that we've noticed. So it's not required that a reevaluation is not required for adding a new area, as we just said. It can be done with appropriate data in an amendment or a review, but in some cases where we do need more information, we may do that through a reevaluation, and so the support for the new area is going to show up in those reevaluation questions. But then again, we would also, in a new goal area, we'd again summarize the need in there, and we would have a prior written notice describing this new service and why that is happening. And so this next section, trial placement, and we often use the phrase 45-day trial out is what we're talking about. So this process for potential discontinuation of all services, and when we're talking about this, we're talking about all services, not just, for example, removing one goal. So if we're looking at the possibility that a student will no longer be an eligible individual, inform the parents clearly of our intent. That's just a very big reminder given here. We certainly want parents up front to know that this is the thinking. However, when we're considering that, an option is a trial placement, and we know that a reevaluation is always required if, at the point at which we would completely exit a student. So at the end of a trial placement, such as a 45-day trial out, there would have to be reevaluation questions completed to support that exit. So we would typically, reevaluation is required to complete the trial placement, so we would typically initiate the trial placement by obtaining parental consent for reevaluation. So it would be informing the parents, we're looking at this trial placement, we would inform parents of the reevaluation, get consent if needed, and we would proceed with that. So what's happening during a trial out or the trial placement? This little section is a good reminder that when we do a trial placement or a trial out, data are collected on a regular basis because we want to inform ourselves of the impact of discontinuing services. So we would monitor our IEP goals with progress monitoring during the trial. We would want to review data regularly. And remember that it's not a given that student will exit. We're trying. So if we are collecting regular progress monitoring data during a trial out, for example, a 45-day trial, if the data indicate the student is not being successful or that the IEP is not being implemented as designed, then the IEP team should potentially make changes to continue or modify. So just a reminder that we're collecting data, we're looking at the success of the trial placement, and in some cases, a student may not exit, and there may be some adjustments to what's happening during that trial. Functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans, so FBAs and BIPs. There is some clarifying language and some changes that we want to talk about. First of all, starting in August here, the way that web IEP programming will work for FBAs and BIPs is changing. We know that previously, when a new FBA or BIP is completed and new information would overwrite the existing information, so that there were sometimes occurrences that old information and the timeline of its creation could be lost. So for a number of years, we've had FBAs and BIPs kind of standing alone on the side of the IEP, and sometimes we've had this process that would overwrite existing information. So in the future here, after these programming changes are completed in August, it will no longer be possible to modify an FBA or a BIP without an IEP process. So in other words, an FBA or BIP cannot just be modified outside of a formal process. It would always be done in the context of a review or a reeval. And notice here it says if the existing FBA or BIP continues to be relevant, and the new FBA or BIP teams could copy and paste content into a new FBA or BIP. So there are some possibilities there. Now, at the time of this recording, there was actually some very current information on really some corrections. In the July 1st procedures, there was some language that talked about how the FBA and the BIP would actually work in terms of programming in Web IEP as this programming is being completed. Some incorrect information is in there because of changes in programming, and I'm now going to shift to a handout that was just recently released here that gives corrections to that. When I'm issuing this video, I'm also going to put a link to that correction sheet, so that'll be readily accessible to people as well. And so what you're looking at, just this essentially a small handout that is actually corrections to the July 1st release, and it's kind of specifics on that will guide individuals on how this FBA BIP process will work in terms of actual programming. So again, I'm going to include this in the package when I send out this video to widely to the AA for people's reference. So we'd like people to use this as a guide for creating, reviewing, and revising FBAs and BIPs. So the language here at the top is still similar. It's just reminding us to what was in the original procedures, that whenever we make changes, it will involve a new IEP process. The FBA and BIP will not just be modifiable on the side as they have been. For the programming to work well, it is pointed out here that whether you're documenting the first FBA and BIP, creating a new IEP for a student who has these, or amending the FBA or BIP, it's very important to check the appropriate box on page B. That's going to interact with the programming. So that box that we normally would do is just a reminder to highlight that or to check that. That's the box that says yes, behavior is a concern and will be addressed in the attached FBA and BIP. So you will recall that's a checkbox on page B, but it'll be even more important for people to check that, as that's going to interact with the programming and the way the FBA and the BIP forms will work. So how will we do this for different scenarios? Let's kind of walk through those. And as people try this out, they'll be able to see the changes that have been made in Web IEP. So for the first FBA and BIP, we would start out by checking yes, the behavior is a concern and will be addressed on page B. Then on the Forms tab, we would select FBA and BIP from the Forms. And there's a note there for an initial evaluation and an initial IEP. When an FBA has already been created as part of the child find, we'd only select BIP. So in some cases, that FBA would have been completed as part of the initial child find evaluation. But we'd indicate that these are new and we'd complete them. Okay, so there'll be a process when it's the first FBA and BIP for a student. What about for this scenario? For an FBA and BIP for a student whose current IEP indicates an FBA and BIP and the IEP as a review or a reevaluation, we'd again start out by checking the appropriate box. Yes, behavior is a concern, and we're going to need an FBA BIP. On the Form tabs, we'd select the FBA and BIP, and then you can see some choices here. There would be an option to select new if the BIP and FBA are going to be completely rewritten, which may be sometimes the case. Or we'll be able to select copy review without changes. The form will be filled with existing data. And so that's an option we'd select if the information is still valid. So there is that option to maintain the current one, although we do it within the IEP process. And the third option is copy review with changes. And so then that would pull in the previous FBA or BIP, and it may be edited. This is an option when the FBA or BIP will be changed, but the changes are not significant enough for a complete rewrite. So with the finalization of this programming, there are some options that can save us some time, can pull over that information so that it can be edited. But it will always be done within an IEP process versus kind of on the side. Next scenario, For an FBA and a BIP for a student whose current IEP includes an FBA and BIP, and the IEP is being amended to address behavior, to address the FBA and BIP, we again start out by checking, yes, the behavior is a concern. We're going to address it. We'd again choose the forms from the forms list. We'd have the option of clicking New for a complete rewrite, or we'd have the option of Copy Review with changes, where we can modify some existing data. And there is a note here for an amendment that addresses the FBA or FBA, don't select Copy Review without changes. In other words, if our purpose is to address some needs for behavior, we know we're going to make at least some changes rather than just carrying forward the existing one. And then finally, for an FBA and BIP for a student whose current IEP includes an FBA and BIP, and the IEP is being amended for reasons other than to address them, no action is needed. So perhaps a student does have an FBA and a BIP, but a team might be doing an IEP, a review or an amendment for the purpose of addressing something else, reading, writing, math. If we're not, if our purpose is not to address the BIP or FBA, we can leave that alone in that scenario. So that handout I just walked through was actually a handout of corrections, and it was specifically referring to how the programming will work in Web IEP for FBAs and BIPs. And so that will stand as essentially a correction to some of the language that was originally put out in the July 1st release. I've gone back to the release notes here, and there's one other matter that I want to mention here, and that's in terms of obtaining parental consent. So you can see here in this little section, when we're talking about new FBAs, new functional behavior assessments, there's a letter to Gallo, a statement by OSEP back in 2013. I'd like to highlight that. It mentioned an FBA is generally understood to be an individualized evaluation of a child in accordance with code to assist in determining whether the child is or continues to be a child with a disability. The FBA process is frequently used to determine the nature and extent of the special education and related services that the child needs, including the need for a BIP. As with other individualized evaluation procedures, and consistent with rule, and parental consent is required for an FBA to be conducted as part of the individual evaluation or the reevaluation. So you can see this statement here, if this assessment, a new FBA, meets IDA's definition of an evaluation, and it requires more than reviewing existing data, obtain parental consent. So if an FBA is requiring the collection of significant new assessment information, that's when we would obtain parental consent, whether that be through an initial or through a reevaluation. However, you can see down here there's also kind of a definition of existing data. So in some cases, we're gathering existing data, and if new information is needed, we know if new information is needed, new assessment information, we're really required to obtain parental consent. But existing data may include things like things collected as part of IEP goal progress monitoring, data collection that might be called for in a BIP. Existing information also includes data that's gathered through observations made in the course of providing instruction and interventions. So the new FBA may be updated with existing information and with the conclusions drawn from existing information without parental consent. This is an area where AA staff are going to be having some additional discussions on how we're handling these situations. Realize that sometimes that line between gathering new information and synthesizing existing data can be a little bit gray, but we want to be in a place where if the AA provider or assessor is pretty confident that they are gathering new information, and that would meet IDA's definition of an evaluation, where it's going to be important to make sure we obtain parental consent. But that's not to say that there will be lots of times where sometimes gathering existing information from data collection is called for in a BIP or a goal, or even through the course of intervention. Synthesizing that data may be viewed as existing data where that consent may not be needed. And just a reminder here, regardless, the FBA and BIP are part of an IEP process, and regardless of the consent or not, we always want parental participation and knowledge of these kind of things. Some sharpening of language regarding progress monitoring of IEP goals, particularly with this idea of the frequency of the data collection and repeated measures. Let's take a look at these highlighted notes here. Measures must accurately assess the skills being taught and be administered with sufficient frequency for educators to be responsive to the child's needs. So unchanged is this principle that in most situations, data is expected to be collected and entered into the graphing program every 2 weeks. But note here, unless the IEP specifies a different period of time between data points. So we're given some bullet points here, some considerations regarding the frequency of monitoring. So consideration of frequency is less than every 2 weeks. Measures are not sensitive to change every 2 weeks. Data collection every 2 weeks does not align with the service delivery model. Perhaps the person providing the service is providing it less frequently than every 2 weeks. And then also the potential need for more frequent progress monitoring when rapid changes may be necessary. So even that idea that for some situations, data collection more than every 2 weeks may be necessary. So we're left with the principle that as a rule of thumb, data would be entered every 2 weeks, but that says unless the IEP specifies a different point of time. So infrequently we might have very few situations where that would not apply, but it would be expected that the IEP would describe the frequency, because we're required to honor the frequency that's specified in the IEP. But again, one example, if a service provider was not seeing the child that frequently, it may be less in rare circumstances. But still, for all practical purposes, most teachers, or this guidance still leads us to the point that in almost all goals, we'd be looking for data collected every 2 weeks. But again, visual displays are required. Data collection must be completed as specified in the IEP, what the IEP says, which is most often going to be every 2 weeks. And we know that for the vast majority of data is being graphed. It must be graphed, but in the web IEP. But the guidance still tells us if we're using some other type of visual display, other type of graphing other than web IEP, we need to collect the data as often as the IEP requires, and the graph must be uploaded. So again, this is not new, but a reminder that in the pretty unusual circumstances where a teacher may not be using the graphing in web IEP, they would have to then upload their graphs to the system so that they're living as associated files. Let's spend a few minutes talking about the issue of open enrollment and responsibility for FAPE for students that have disabilities. A little bit of language here in the release notes talk about that once a receiving district approves open enrollment for an eligible individual, that district is responsible for providing FAPE until open enrollment ends. And you can see in this section here, which is not new, but it's citing information from the open enrollment rules. Open enrollment really only terminates when the student graduates, moves into the receiving district, moves out of state, moves into a different district, and chooses to attend that new resident district, attends an accredited non-public school, or drops out. If a student is placed temporarily in foster care, juvenile detention center or treatment facility or similar placement, the open enrollment status will automatically be reinstated when the student returns. So, in other words, once open enrollment is approved, that student, in essence, belongs to the receiving district. So, if after accepting an eligible individual through open enrollment, the receiving district determines that it cannot meet the needs of the child, the receiving district continues to be responsible for FAPE, but they might seek a placement in another district. So they would still be part of that receiving district, but if they then deem we cannot meet your special education needs, there could be a placement outside of that original receiving district. But note here, while a receiving district can deny open enrollment if it asserts that it does not have an appropriate program, it can't terminate open enrollment if it says that it does not have an appropriate placement. They would need to look for a new placement, perhaps outside that district. If a placement is made into another district, open enrollment transfers to the receiving district until such time as the original receiving district has an appropriate program and the IEP team concurs with that. And then there is a resolution process as needed. But I think the key piece there is once the district accepts the child for open enrollment, they're responsible for providing FAPE, and they can't terminate open enrollment. However, we do know when a child initially applies for open enrollment to a district, the receiving district has a couple reasons why they could deny that request for open enrollment. And example one is lack of classroom space, but also a valid reason is that when they first apply, the district, the potential receiving district, can assert that they are not able to meet the special education needs, and that could be the basis for denial. Now you're looking now at a flowchart that's been revised slightly, that's guiding the process, what the LEA and AA should do when a student with a disability, when a student with an IEP may apply for open enrollment. This guides our process, and it's a pretty helpful flowchart. A couple of years ago, a version of this flowchart first appeared in the procedures primarily for the purpose of our 2 virtual schools in Iowa. Because it was emphasized that they were to go through a process of making sure that if they were to accept open enrolled students into their virtual school, that they could meet the special education needs. However, in the years since that's happened, it's been reemphasized that really that process should happen for all students with disabilities. Rule tells us that there needs to be a process of reviewing that student's needs if they're applying for open enrollment to a district, and making sure that if they are to be accepted in the receiving district, that district can meet their needs. So let's walk through the flowchart and try to put these pieces together. So we start out, parents of a student with special education applies for open enrollment. Next step, the receiving district informs their local AEA of the student application. So this was a new process that was kind of announced last year, just really a reminder that when this happens, when one of our districts receives an application for open enrollment for any student with an IEP, they're to inform their local AEA of that application. And then what happens, you can see here in the yellow, the receiving district, resident district, and AEA or AEAs consult to determine if the receiving district has adequate classroom space and the district and AA can provide an appropriate program. Okay, so there needs to be a meeting involving these parties. That often is a telephonic, electronic meeting, but that meeting needs to happen. In our AA in Green Hills, our process will be that the district will notify the AA, and that often may come to, that could either come to a regional administrator that's working with the district or potentially a special education rep. They will work together to determine who from the AA will be represented in the meeting to have this discussion. So that could either be a regional administrator or a special education rep or both. Okay, then some decisions are made based on that meeting. It could be no, either, so it could be a denial based on classroom space, and again, that really that has nothing to do necessarily with special education. Or if we said no, it would be this number 2 here, that the district cannot provide an appropriate program. And a reminder here that if we deny on that basis of we can't, if a district says, or if this team determines they've applied for open enrollment, but we can't meet the needs in a program, we have to provide prior written notice explaining why. Okay, so it could be a no for one of 2 reasons, or it could be a yes. The receiving district approves open enrollment application, and the AEA notifies the resident AA of this decision if support services are outlined in the current IEP. So, for example, speech or those kinds of support services. So one of those 2 decisions is made. Then we continue down. The receiving school district documents the date of the consultation and its determination to approve or deny open enrollment on the open enrollment application. Now this next box in rule, if there is disagreement, if the appropriateness of the special education program in the receiving district is at question, the final determination falls to the AA Director of Special Education, in which the potential receiving district is located. So any party questioning the determination may request that the AA Director of Special Education do a review in writing. So that could be, if there was disagreement, the AA Director of Special Education would make that final decision. And there is a model letter. So I've just scrolled ahead here. We noted earlier in Green Hills AA, typically either a regional administrator and or a special education rep would be involved in having this meeting, this consultation with the involved districts. If there was a disagreement, this model letter just illustrates how the matter may go on to the AA Director of Special Education for a final decision on whether or not it's deemed appropriate to meet the needs or not. A few sections regarding special placements had some modifications in the release notes. Just one note here for out-of-state placements. We know that while it's rare, within our AA we have a smaller number of students who have out-of-state placements for different reasons in special schools. Sometimes a special school is near the border on the state. One highlight here we're going to cover, but as a quick review here, when this is being proposed, there would need to be an IEP meeting looking at the potential need. A prior written notice would be required to indicate the change of placement, and evidence that there was exploration of options. And there is a out-of-state form that's request to the Department of Education. We know that has been and will continue to be when there's a request for an out-of-state placement, that goes to the AA Special Education Director, and then that is forwarded to the Iowa Department of Education for approval. So that's not new, that has been happening. One highlighted section here, just a reminder that there should be documentation in the IEP that includes a program to prepare the eligible individuals transition back to the LEA. So we're basically reminded here that in those rare instances when we do have students that are tuitioned to an out-of-state placement, we want to be considering and have in place a plan for how we would transition them back. Regarding competent private instruction, CPI, a type of homeschooling, there were only a couple of small wordsmithing kinds of items in the release notes, but I wanted to just take a few minutes to review a couple of the key procedural things for responding to requests for CPI for our students with disabilities. The section that you're looking at here talks about the process. If a family is requesting competent private instruction and the student has an IEP, There is a requirement that the director, the AA Special Education Director or designee, you can see here, review available documentation, including a competent private instruction worksheet, and make a determination. So there's an approval process where the director or designee is to approve the request for CPI. In Green Hills, our procedure this year would be that our local regional administrators would be the original designees. So when our AA staff, most often special education reps, are aware of a family that would be applying for CPI, they would notify the regional administrator, and ultimately the regional administrator will make a recommendation to our special education director regarding whether or not that should be approved. And what is the competent private instruction worksheet that was mentioned in there? In Appendix A of the procedures, there is this model worksheet, and this is something that actually should be completed in a ideal situation. We would probably have an IEP team meeting sitting with a parent going through these options, but when a request is going to come in and we said to your local regional administrator, the idea would be that this worksheet would be completed, and then the RA would have an opportunity to review the student's IEP in order to make a recommendation to our director as to whether it should be, the request should be approved. But if you look at the worksheet, you can see it's just it's a handy tool to, for one thing, help parents understand some of their options, and because there really are 5. So in other words, if they're requesting to homeschool, option 1 is dual enrollment with all special education services continuing. So there could be a dual enrollment where some things would be done in the home, but the request could be for all the special ed services to continue. And again, there's kind of reminders here of some of the forms and process items that would follow with this worksheet. It kind of prompts us for those things. Option 2, dual enrollment with all special education services continued, but with significant changes. Maybe the amount of time has changed or the nature of the service. Number 3 is dual enrollment with some but not all special education services continued. So just when you look at options 1 through 3 here, there are options where special ed services will continue even though there might be some modifications or potentially dual enrollment situation. On the other hand, option 4, dual enrollment for a student eligible for special education whose parent has chosen only general education or extracurricular activities. And then option 5, no dual enrollment and no school involvement. So this would be parents that would completely and fully homeschool. And so there's a space for comments, and then this would be submitted. Again, we're saying our designee this year would be our RAs, who would then collaborate and make a recommendation to our Director of Special Education. And backing up just a bit here for a reminder that in this kind of global title of private instruction that we often think of as homeschooling, there is a private instruction handbook. In fact, there's a link in the procedures and the release notes that will take us directly to the DE website that will have all those details. But just a quick reminder as we're kind of reviewing this topic, Iowa Code actually allows 3 forms of private instruction. If you were to look on the DE's private instruction handbook site, there's sort of a chart format that helps us look at this as well. But in brief, competent private instruction, CPI option 1, is private instruction under the supervision of a licensed practitioner, or CPI option 2, private instruction by a non-licensed person, or the third, which was new to us several years ago, independent private instruction, or IPI. So special education considerations for competent private instruction option 1, if the parent is asking for a CPI and this child has a disability, be obtained by the Director of Special Education. CPI option 2, again, that variation, same idea. when we're talking about a parent asking for CPI, if there's a disability involved, we have that process of seeking approval from the AA, Director of Special Education. However, when we look at IPI, or Independent Private Instruction, and you can see some of the criteria for that. If a parent is citing or seeking that they will be engaging in IPI, even if there's a disability, it's important to remember that consent from the AA, Director of Special Education, is not required. So when parents are citing CPI, we are required to go through that approval process. If it's IPI, we are not. So 4+ services. Last year, the Department of Education in Iowa provided us some additional guidance and some considerations for IEP teams to think about 4+ services. What are they? 4+ services are secondary services that are a part of the student's secondary schooling and included on an IEP. So the purpose of them is to fulfill unmet transition needs resulting from the student's disability. And so sometimes we have students that maybe continue in their IEP in a site other than at the high school. That could be a local community college. It could be in the community through a collaborative program with Iowa Voc Rehab, or in the community, or through other providers. So there is some additional language that describes 4+ programs, but I would point you to a link that's actually within the procedures where it says DE guidance for 4+ services. That was actually released in January 2017. Many of you have had a chance to look at this, but it's a helpful document that gives us some pretty strong guidance on how we would look at 4+. And we're reminded as we kind of glance at some of this guidance, I would encourage everybody to read this really thoroughly, particularly if you're going to be working with transition age students and the topic may come up at IEP meetings. Students who participate in 4+ services cannot be graduates of the school district because they would be continuing on an IEP, on a weighted IEP. Districts have the option of allowing students to participate in the commencement ceremony if their policy has permitted that, but a diploma is not dated and signed until after they would complete this 4+ program. District is responsible for all costs directly associated with FAPE in a 4+ model, but determining which costs are necessary for FAPE and which are not really does kind of take a close look at the individual needs. And so an IEP team would need to spend some time discussing those kinds of things. A link within this guidance is a sample contract for 4+ services that districts could use, and that's would be helpful for to make sure that there's common understanding of financial implications for a district and what they would be paying for in the programs. And just one highlight, the issue of living on campus in a college kind of a setting, if that were the model for 4+. The guidance points out that for those students involved in 4+ programs, living on campus is a student choice at parental cost, except 2 conditions. In some cases, special design instruction related to living skills are necessary. That may be part of the unmet transition needs in the IEP. And so in that case, residential costs may be necessary for FAPE, or the local district placed a student too far away from home, and so return home daily would not be practical. So in that case, residential living may be part of a district expense as well. So a couple final items. The parental rights summary. Now, not to be confused with the large parental rights booklets that remain unchanged, but the short parental rights summary has had a slight update, and that's reflecting some recent litigation, the Andrew F. case. And so some emphasis. You can see the quote here: to meet its substantive obligation under the IDEA, a school must offer an IEP reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. Um, so a recent, some recent litigation that was a fairly major, brought to light this issue of what is appropriate progress for a student. And so a slight bit of language in the summary has been modified to reflect that, and you can see the language in yellow here. Summary now states educational benefit is a broad term that includes access to the general education curriculum for all students, access to the same activities and settings as children who do not have disabilities, and services and supports that are reasonably calculated to allow your child to make progress that is appropriate in light of your child's circumstances. So just a slight change in language there, but does kind of highlight, to parents that a parental right is that we would expect your child to grow, to make progress that is appropriate, and so that is a change there. Per the procedures recommendations, existing summaries, may be used, but as we print new ones, we'll want to make sure that the June 2017 version is added. Last thing just noted here is that when the procedures document went to press or was finalized last summer, there were some late-breaking changes being made to the weighting matrices that guide how we assign weightings to our IEPs, and so they were not included in the manual. This is just a note that they are included in the manual now, and can be found in Appendix A. This is Ron Russell with Green Hills AA. I'd like to thank you for spending some time listening to the review of these changes. There were a variety of them this year. We are going to be disseminating this video summary along with some other information pretty widely, in the hopes that teachers and AA staff and our special education coordinators will take some time to review this and just get familiar with some of the modifications that have happened this year. Thanks again for listening.